Well, welcome everybody. I am going to do a tutorial, and it's probably going to be about a two-part tutorial. Hopefully it doesn't go longer and this is a very niche-y kind of idea here, is how I might approach a game maker team project using Git and GitHub. As you can see, that's my repository for the game maker shooting gallery. And the idea here is that I want to work as a team. I want to be able to work at home. I want to work at school. I'm working with a guy named Fred. Fred's on my team. And what we do is we're putting together this awesome project for our senior project. And we just really like Game Maker. We're comfortable with it, and we want to be able to collaborate. So this poses some really interesting problems. And the primary problem is the fact that in version control works great with text files. Like a gitignore file is a text file. This is real easy to see what's going on. If I do one thing, Fred does something else, and we try to combine those two, it may actually get automatically merged together without us having to do anything. And GitHub is really awesome in merging together text files. Another type of text file that's really good to use would be things like scripts. Because if you look at it, we can sort of see the code, and if we can read the code and there's an issue, we can sort of resolve that issue fairly well. It's pretty easy. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is what makes Game Maker difficult. And the thing that makes it difficult in version control is here, I made wrong folder. There's two folders. I'll explain that in a bit. The problem is this main.gmk, and it's the same as an executable, exe, or a GB1, GB2, is that these are called binary files. And a binary file, if we were to look at it on Notepad++, this is what the binary file looks like. Now, try to imagine if there's a conflict. And by the way, if I make one little change on Game Maker, onto main GMK, one little change, I can't get that change to Fred by itself without him either choosing his version of main or my version of main. There is no automatically combine and fuse it all together on a GMK file. So this is where the primary problem is. So there's a lot of strategies for working through it. I'm going to start with sort of the visual strategy you can kind of see here. Couple things. If you're going to use version control, the first thing I recommend you do is have a gitignore. And on the gitignore, it's all the things we want Git to not pay attention to. And right now, it's exe files and these GB files, which are the backups. Technically, I can get rid of that if I want to. I have it here. I'm not going to mess with Git for right now. I'm just going to leave it as is. Gitignore is really good because then when you have other folders, they don't get littered with this stuff. And I go over to the other folder here, and you can see on the right, I have this main GB1, main GB2, and we don't have that over here. Okay, and so we're not going to be passing these backups back and forth. While we're talking about the backup, another thing you probably need to do, and I think it's worth doing, is go into main, and all of you should do this at some point. Now, this is not part of the version control aspect. Oh, I keep doing that. I keep hitting the executable file. We're ignoring the executable file because this is the editing file. Now, you'll notice a couple versions of main. So actually, before I open it, let's talk about that too while we're at it. Main.gmk is going to be sort of the master file. And this is the end-all, be-all. This is the thing that the team has to choose to do. If I want to experiment, I work on my version, which is main Chris. And if Fred wants to experiment, he works on his. I leave Fred's alone. Fred leaves mine alone. And while we're working in our 2-week cycle of getting work done, I leave main alone. I wait till Fred and I can get together. And whether we do that virtually on a video conference or we do that in person is not really the concern. But when we're ready to make the next version of main and to bring in our changes, we could do that on main. Okay, and so I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. But before I get there, let's talk about the backup files. So we're going to go into main to do this, and you're going to want to do this on any version of the game. You're going to want to go to File and preferences. A lot of people actually will keep backup copies. And the nice thing about backup copies is that if yours something gets polluted or whatever, you can go to one of the backup files. I do actually recommend you just turn it off. Okay. And I'm going to close it, and I'm going to actually delete those two files. And then one of the things you will note is that those won't come back anymore. Now, why am I okay deleting them? I'm okay deleting them because I use version control, and the version control is my form of a backup. So now I'm going to open up mine because I am Chris, and this is really important. So ignore the fact that I just changed main. That was just for a demonstration purposes. And there, backup copies is not on there either. We're good. So I close that file. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about the structure of what we do. And one way to make collaboration better is to make more modular code. And what I mean by modular code is break things up into smaller pieces if you can. And the best way to illustrate that is the folders you see here. There's a folder for scripts, one for sounds, one for sprites. Okay. By the way, there's nothing in sounds. So until I put something in sounds, you'll notice this folder over here is under version control also. There's no folder. There won't be until I put a sound, commit it, push it to GitHub, and then in this folder, pull those changes in. By the way, if I hadn't mentioned this, I'm expecting this video is for someone who already knows a little bit about Git. Okay, so hopefully you've already got the main idea behind Git. I'm opening up main just to show you the structure of GameMaker and how I try to leverage that structure. Sprites, we have a series of sprites in this folder. And since each of these are separate graphical files, and any one of us could work on a particular sprite, as long as we communicate well, and I say, hey, Fred, I'll do a sprite duck target, I'll fix it, you fix something else. As long as we communicate, and there shouldn't ever be any problem. But you'll notice we have a sprites folder here, and all of our sprites go into this sprites folder. And there's actually some extra sprites you didn't see, but we won't go into that. I do the same thing for any kind of asset. That goes for sounds, backgrounds, anything else that's a file that you pull into GameMaker. Okay, so that's an important part. The other thing that's really important is scripts. So let's talk a little bit about scripts. First of all, actually, let's go. I'll leave this folder open. And while it's open, you'll see there are two scripts, controller, target, bullets. Let's go to main, and let's look at our scripts folder in here. And I'll keep that folder open so you can sort of compare as we look. So the scripts folder here have my scripts in here, and they're actually pulling from this folder. Okay, so basically we keep this up to date here. And so that's sort of making it module 2. And then if you look at objects, you're going to see that there is a controller object. There it's object controller, and a target bullets object. Now, the way I name these scripts is my choice, and I just decided to just give it the name of the object, but without the object underscore. And I could have put script underscore controller, but it's in a folder called scripts. So I don't think it's that important that I change the name for that. And as long as you as a team decide and agree, that's great. So let's talk about how these scripts are used and how this is kind of a cool little feature you can do. So I'm going to look at object target bullet. Now, remember I told you, let's look at two objects, one that uses scripts and one that doesn't. Object whole versus object target bullets. Object whole has two events, and one event has two actions, including execute script controller. We can fix that. We can put that all in here as well. And then there's alarm, and there's that. Okay, and let's look at another object while we're at it. Duck has 3 events. Each one has 1 or more actions. Okay, so that's 3 events and 4 different actions for those events. Well, technically speaking, any event has a GML script that can do it. We can write a GML script for create. We can write one for an alarm event. We can write one for a left button push. In fact, just to show you that, let's take a look at a left button push in a script. So I open up target bullet, and there it is. If mouse check button pressed MB left. That's how I check to see if the mouse is being pressed. So we got that. Left button. That's the same thing as these two. They're right there. And then we have some actions over on the object target duck. But here are some actions over here in this script. So you see, you can actually put all of the code into one script. You do have to add an event, and that's step. Okay, but we can put all of our code into a script that we basically manage outside of GameMaker. And then that makes it so when it's time to update main, it's going to be a whole lot easier if we have objects that already has a step involved and already has an action, and all we have to do is just make sure we've updated the scripts. It's gonna speed up the time. If we have if we're gonna work together as a team and we come together and I as Chris decided to add these 3 events and all these actions, on my version of the game, and let's say they're not here, well, that's going to take more time to add all the events, add all the actions. We have to dig and find them. It takes longer. Even if you know what the actions are, you still have to go find where they are, grab them, and draw them over. So the scripts are a way easier way to manage when it comes time to bring your changes together. Okay. And speaking of that, let's now talk about bringing the changes together and some general guidelines I recommend. Number 1, like I said, if it's an asset, create a folder in your project folder and make sure there's a copy of each of it. If you have an object, it's best to have a step event with a script. Now, let me show you the step event because there are actually 3 step events. There's begin step, step, and end step. Chronologically, begin is first, steps in the middle, end is last. So if you need things where something has to happen before something else, you could actually, for each object, add these different events. The only trick is each one should probably target a different script. So that is something worth noting. Okay, so if you can get it with one event step and one action, this is going to make things a lot simpler. So I recommend the first thing you do, and if you've already started on a GameMaker game and you want to collaborate, I recommend you step by step. I wouldn't just go in and change all these objects at once to have a step event and calling up a script. I would actually do this one at a time, and maybe one person can be in charge, or each person divvy up. So one person takes 2 or 3, and the other person takes the others. And I would only do one at a time, testing each one as you go. You want to make sure that by adding a script, you don't change the behavior. So that's something worth looking at. Another thing is that what's really important here, because these are binary files and we're working together, is that I should only work on my copy of the game. I shouldn't touch Fred's, and I shouldn't touch main either. And I know you saw me going in there and making changes to it. Okay, so that's not what should happen. So this is what should happen. So at some point, you start this out. You start out the process. And one person can make main and main for each other person. Okay. But at some point, you're going to start working, right? So let's take the beginning of a sprint cycle after we've been doing some work for a while. Okay. And so what I want to show you is that the first thing you should probably do is get together and demonstrate what you've done. So I might go into main Chris and show Fred the things I've done. Say, here, I've added this, and this seems to work pretty cool, and that's working great. And you guys decide, yeah, let's incorporate, let's add that. So if you wanted to do that, what you could do is at that meeting, you got a couple options. You could have, you could just open up both side by side and make the changes you need. And if you did it well, there's probably not a lot of changes you need to do. Maybe it's remove all your actions, add a step event, and add the script and do that. That's probably still quicker than adding all the separate events and adding all the actions for each one. So you see how that works? So you get together and then you as a team update main. And you have to do it manually, which is why I recommend having all the things broken up as more modular. Okay. So let's say we're at main and we go in here, and as main, we like a certain thing. I'm just going to do a quick check here. I'm going to move this to one side. I'm going to open up my version here, and I'm going to open it up on the right. And so we can kind of see them side by side. So I just want to double check to see if I have everything the same. I'm going to look at objects, and the first thing I want to do is look at object targets bullet on one side over here. It looks like these are the same. I open up scripts. I got controller, target bullets. I open up here, controller, target bullets. Let's open up this script and let's open up this script. Live score. Okay. So here's the first thing. Okay. The first thing here is that the scripts over in main Chris is up to date and this one is not. So what we want to do is as a team, we're like, okay, so it looks like we need to update target bullets as a script. So what I'm going to do is instead of actually editing it here, I'm just going to go in here and open that up. And by opening it up, notice, remember, I'd already changed that file. So now I get the updated file. So that's what you have to do. And then you just click check so that now we've got the changes here. So let's say that's the only thing we had to do and everything else we're still working on or whatever. Okay. Like I said, you're working on together on these projects and bringing them together. But let's say at this point, Fred has decided that Fred wants a copy of that now. And I've decided things are good. Okay, what I can do now is save main.gmk. And now what I can do is close this. And just to be safe, if we know main is up to date, I can just go into main and do a save as and save it as main-chris. And I replace it. Okay, so now I have the latest version of main and I can proceed my work and do some new work on it. Okay, so there it is, main Chris. And Fred will go open up main. I'll pretend to be Fred. So Fred goes into main, opens it up, and then Fred is going to do a file, save as, and save it as main Fred, so that now Fred can take main, work on it, and then not have conflicts between him and me. Okay, so there's main Fred. So once you've got main up to date, save it as your branch, and then work on it. Okay. Now, so that's just how I would go about doing it that way. Now, I think I'm looking at the time. It's taken longer than I thought. So I'm going to go ahead and stop now. I've given you the general overflow. On the next video tutorial, I want to talk about working with Git and how you would manage the work that you do on Git so that you're going to minimize the number of conflicts that you have. So stay tuned for that.